Well, we are in the second half of Exodus 22 tonight, and we are still looking through the civil laws given mainly for the judges, those over tens, over hundreds, over thousands, but also to those who would judge in the case of fairness and justice. And so there was definitely a percent of where the people could know what's coming and could actually show mercy if they wanted, rather than to say, bring justice in this situation. So everybody was to know and understand. And of course, we looking at this say, okay, it's an insight into God's nature, into his mindset. I had a whole list of quotes, and I don't think I have time tonight, but next week I'll bring them, of all our founding fathers and what they thought of the Bible and its importance of establishing our country with the biblical principles. And a lot of them that are called deists and not real Christians and all this, not from their own quotes. Great website called The Wall Builders. Dave Barton, a fan of his way back when he was a young guy. He's very, very brilliant, very hard worker, very diligent to make sure everything is correct. But anyway, I think that our forefathers understood that the Bible was unique when it came to the civil laws. But again, this is for this is for Israel, not for saying everybody in the world should follow this. Definitely doesn't say, hey, Christianity needs to be established on this. Definitely no such thing whatsoever is the case. Well, in verse 16 and 17, if a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Now, if her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay the money according to the bride price of the virgin. Now, notice here, she's not betrothed. So you might have in the community a number of women that are not yet officially married, but they are committed to be married. And in this culture, it was the same as being married. To get out of the betrothal, you had to actually go through a divorce. So it was, once you shook hands and said, this is your husband, this is your wife, and when you got to wait till you have the dowry, or you got to wait till you're a certain age, or a number of reasons they're not getting married this moment. But boy, in the eyes of the community, she's married, she's taken. So you'll notice here that this is a young girl, so a teenager probably, and fooling around with one of the young guys that he or she they like each other, and they're goofing off, and chemistry starts happening, and things go from, heavy petting to actually having sex, and she lost her virginity. Now, the reason this would be brought up is because a woman that tried to get married and played off that she was a virgin when she wasn't a virgin was serious business. In Deuteronomy 22, the whole family basically gets defamed, but she gets put to death. She gets stoned to death. The guy who says she's not a virgin, he better be right, because if he's wrong, he gets shame, and he gets 100 pounds of shekels he has to pay as a fine to the family. But if the young woman is found to not be a virgin when she said she was a virgin, this is in Exodus 22, verse 13 to 21, then she was to be stoned to death. So being a virgin was essential to get married in this culture. Now, if you had been married before, like in the story of Ruth, and she's marrying Boaz. Well, she was married before. She says, I know I'm not marrying a virgin. So that's understood. I'm marrying somebody who's been married before. Almost never happened in this culture. It was very rare, as many Eastern cultures to this day. There really wasn't a second marriage. You know, I just watched a documentary on the women of Iran. And, this was actually Iraq. But I watched one earlier on Iran. It was even worse. But, you know, a guy marries some 11-year-old girl, and then he decides, I don't like her. And he goes to the mufti and pays him a bunch of money. And so now she's divorced, but she's not a virgin, even though she may be 12 or 13 or 14 years old. And she can't even go home. Her family can't even take her back, because she's dishonored herself. She's not a virgin, and she was not pleasing to her husband. The only recourse in Iraq and Iran and the Arab cultures today is to be a prostitute. And usually with that comes, you know, drug addiction and having babies, and it's just a whole subculture that is sad as can be. So being a virgin in this culture is absolutely huge. Now, I'd say, in much of the world today, it is a very essential thing to be a virgin if you want to be married. In, for sure, the Arab world, I would also say in the Indian world, in Hinduism the same, and I would say in the Asian culture, not all of them, but most of them, it's a very important thing. And of course, in the Jewish culture, they would, and in many cultures today, they bring out the sheet with blood on it and hang it up there outside the house for everybody to walk by and see that she was indeed a virgin. That's done to this day. It sounds repulsive to us, but yeah, it's something they see all the time. It's not a big deal, but they do it to this day. It is interesting that the place virginity has not that importance of a place is in the quote-unquote Western Christian world. That we have a very minimal thought process on that. Sort of like, oh, that's great, but it's not important. What's that, Peter? Okay. And so again, at the time of Christ, we do know that the Romans took away the power for the Jews to have the death sentence. They had to go to the Romans, and the Romans had to give the death sentence. So I think after they came back from Babylon, I don't think a lot of the laws that had death penalties were ever enforced. So it's on the books religiously, but in practicality, I don't think it happened. But this is important. When Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, it tells us in Matthew 1:19 that he was not wanting to make her a public example, and so he minded to put her away secretly, trying to shuffle off to another city or something where it wouldn't come out in the community that she wasn't a virgin. And in the Gospel of John, the Pharisees sort of infer this when they talk about Jesus. And they say, well, at least I'm not a child, I'm not a bastard, is basically what they called him in the Gospel of John, probably trying to get under his skin to do this. But I think spiritually, the whole point of sexual relation is the outer acting out of a deep spiritual reality. And it's something that happens in the body that links the body, soul, and spirit together as one in a way we can't see or explain. And Paul tried to explain this to the pagan Corinthians who came out of paganism, not out of Judaism. And he says to them in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15 and 16, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? Certainly not. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her. It's a sacred thing that's happening to a stranger. For the two, he says, so become one flesh. So he says, even if it was a total stranger that you're paying money for, as they did in the temple at this time, this was a religious practice, especially certain times of the year, and worshiping, especially the goddess Diana, but all of them had young girls that would be encouraged to be prostitutes for a season or for a couple months out of the year, or dedicate themselves to be prostitutes for the temple. And they would. This was a perfectly acceptable way for a woman to live out her life. So it does tell us that if the father has to agree, so either way, he's got to pay the money. You bought the goods, you broke it, you buy it, sort of. But after he gets the dowry, if it can be, and again, if it's a young man, he probably doesn't have it. But he's got to come up with it one way or another. As we've learned earlier, if he can't, he gets sold into slavery and takes the money for him for whatever. But then the father can say, I'm not sure if I'm going to let you guys marry it, and make him sit on it a few months. Or maybe just say, hey, there's another guy that wants to marry you, even though she's not a virgin, and I'm going to take a second dowry from him, and you're not getting the money back. So it is, again, interesting, and we're going to talk more about this again in the book of Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, because remember, we're looking at a rule, looking at a law, if you would. Really, a lot of them are just principles, especially the moral laws that are connected to the nature of God. And then we're going to start looking at the practical issues of how they have to now apply them. And if you've ever dealt in the legal system, it's always messy. It's never a cookie cutter situation. And you go to countries where everything's a cookie cutter, justice is horrible. And so it doesn't go into it what the price of her dowry would be. Again, if it was a richer girl, it'd probably be a higher dowry. A poor girl, poor. But it's interesting, in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 28 and 29, they do say that it's a minimal of 50 shekels of silver in this case, which is huge, a huge amount of money for a dowry at this time. 50 shekels of silver is a huge amount. So again, it's a pretty stiff thing. So again, they're trying everything they can to keep people to be a virgin until it's time to marry. Well, now we have 3 verses in a row, and all 3 of them have this in common. They're all death penalty when they're committed. The first one, you shall not permit a sorcerer or sorceress, it's in the feminine here, to live. So the word sorcery here, it's talking to familiar spirits. It's going to mention it in Leviticus 19:26 and Leviticus 20:27, and it's going to say a woman to talk with familiar spirits or a wizard. But here, he just mentions it in the female. In the Old King James, actually says a witch. And you say, well, why doesn't it mention the wizard here? Well, he's saying, if you're going to be reluctant on stoning somebody to death, it's going to be the woman. If a guy's a wizard, stone him to death. He's not supposed to, But he's saying here, sort of taking the lesser situation, saying, even if it was a woman, because that is serious stuff, talking to the dead and familiar spirits. Unrelated to this today, I was just studying out some different doctrines of Catholicism. It's this is what pastors do. Their hobby is the Bible and doctrine. So I'm studying into this and starting to get into it. And it was interesting that each time it came up, they turned to this verse in praying to Mary. Because they said, well, hold it. The argument is, haven't you ever asked your wife to pray for you? Yes, but my wife is alive. If she was dead and I ask her, then there's an issue. Mary's dead. She's most blessed of all women. I think she's going to have a high place in heaven. A lot of rewards there. I don't want to take anything away from her. But when you start with Mariology and saying, go talk to Mary and have her talk to Jesus, because he's a busy guy, and who are you to talk to the big guy? You be humble and talk to Mary and this kind of stuff. Again, the point is that it is turning Christianity into a religion of pray to the dead, communicate with the dead, say, many, many prayers, rosaries or whatever to the dead. The Hail Mary is full of grace. And when you really look at that, and if you've been to a country and they're all doing it at once, I don't know if you guys ever been to a funeral, a Catholic funeral, or you've been in a place and you got 300 people going, Hail Mary, full of grace, and it's like, hair goes up on the back of my neck, and I can't stand it even for a couple of minutes. But I know people that were raised Catholic and they think it sounds really lovely, And, I've been to Arab cultures where they have the guy screaming out and, it's time to prayer. And it's like, oh my, that's the most annoying thing in the world. And, but yet they love it. So again, I think you can get conditioned. But it is interesting here that it is indeed a death penalty. And of course, we have probably the most famous story of this, right? When Saul wants to figure out how the battle's going to go the next day, the last day of his life, the second to the last day of his life, and he goes to the witch of Endor. And of course, he dresses up because he knows that he has enforced this. The first king of Israel, something that wasn't being enforced, he enforced, and that was the putting to death of sorceresses. And nevertheless, he said, yeah, your laws isn't getting rid of all of them. There's still some around. I'll take you to one. And indeed they did. It is interesting that it was a pretty common eventuality in the book of Acts. The very first time they went outside Jerusalem, and they came to Samaria. Remember there was Simon the sorcerer, when he saw the miracles that they were performing. He said, hey, I want to be born again. But then he found out quickly it wasn't genuine. He just wanted the power to give the power when he saw them laying hands on people. Paul, right out of the get-go, starts his first missionary journey. First thing he runs into is a sorcerer, this guy Alamitos. And Paul, it says in Acts 13, Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, "O full of all deceit and all fraud, you son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, you will not cease perverting the straight ways of the Lord." Because he was twisting people and lying to people about what Paul was saying. It's interesting that the great revival where Paul ended up pastoring for 3 years in Ephesus, that when salvation came to that giant city of Ephesus, they made a giant pile and people just kept bringing out all their sorceress stuff and all their sorcery books. And they had this giant bonfire of people burning all of their magical books and so forth. So it is a real issue. But I would like to note that nobody in the New Testament was stoned to death for being a sorcerer. In the Old Testament, it was literal and physical. They didn't have metaphorical giants. They had real giants. Okay? They didn't, again, in the Old Testament, they were literally under the law of God. And if they did not keep it, they would basically suffer almost all the time death penalty for not keeping it. That was, again, in the Old Testament. It was literal and physical. So if a guy, as we're going to see later, sleeps with his stepmom, they put him to death. In the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians 5, when a guy marries his stepmom, does he tell the church to kill him? No, they excommunicate him from the church until he repents. And then in 2 Corinthians, he repents and they bring him back in. So it wasn't a physical death, it was a spiritual death where 2 or 3 agree together. So if we shut the doors on earth to this guy, God will shut the doors in heaven to this guy. Whatever we bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And when we open the doors to him on earth, God opened the doors in heaven. Whatever we loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And then the next thing is quite gross. But whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. So again, this is showing, again, you got people that are just going from one thing to the next, deeper and deeper into depravity. Until, as far as I know, I'm sure there's more wicked things than this, more gross, despicable things than this, but this is it. And in the Canaanite culture, this again, people practiced this, was required to practice this. And if you look, and they try to pretend that they gave birth to people that were half animals, half human, So you have all the pagan religions where you got the body of a deer, I guess, and the head of a man, or these kind of things. Again, it's all a part of the practice of worship that they required, and part of that was bestiality. And if you know anything about the sexuality of man, the more perverted he becomes, the more perverted he will become. And that which was satisfying a year ago is not satisfying now. You got to go deeper and darker and more twisted. And again, later, this is one of the very few points, but later, when they went into many of these places, God said, they leave completely Israel or you wipe them out. You can't even have their animals. You kill all of their animals. Again, why? I think their animals were diseased from all the practice of bestiality. I think there was a good percentage of them, and you didn't want their animals mingling with your animals and having disease. We know about AIDS, and we see that. That's almost happened immediately after homosexuality began to become a part of the society. It was a very short time until all of a sudden you've got this incredible disease, and then it begins to affect people outside of the homosexual sphere. Well, the next thing is sacrificing to other gods. It's interesting that earlier in chapter 20, it says we'll not worship any other god. But here in specifics, he says not to sacrifice. So we already know in chapter 20, we're not to worship. But sacrificing is an act of worship to the next level. I'm not just having an idol in my house and praying to it, but now I'm sacrificing. And usually a sacrifice in this culture was sacrifice, to give the sacrifice. It cost them, a lot. It cost them 1% of their animals they really couldn't afford to give up, or it cost them a certain amount of money, or it cost them giving their daughter to the priest of this pagan worship. It was a sacrifice. And really, the willingness to sacrifice sacrificially does show two things. One, it shows how you really feel about the God. And two, it tells you about the God. When we look at God, we're going to go into that tonight, where he tells us to give to him first, the best, the top, tithe of 10%. Everything about it is not for his benefit or for the organization's benefit. It's for our benefit. The generous heart is the heart that's whole and healed and in right relationship between materialism and not being overcome by materialism. And it's the way of setting us free, not binding us up. And again, it's a very small thing that God asks. It's 10%, which is pennies. compared to what he could have asked. Had he asked for 40%, we wouldn't have we wouldn't have said a thing. We were going to accept whatever he said. But 10% and then above that of an offering, again, we're going to talk about that more in time, but again, it's interesting what our God asks us to sacrifice. It's not to go kill people. It's not to do some weird sadistic thing. Not to give our kids over to be burned in a fire, or babies burned in the fire like Molech required, or giving our daughters to be prostitutes in some temple like most of the religions of this time did, or to participate in some kind of worship where you have bestiality happening. All of these perverted things talk about what people are willing to do, how deep they're willing to commit to this. But also it talks about the nature of God, of that God that they are worshiping, and it tells about its nature. Well, now we're going to look in the next few verses about how we treat those in a disadvantaged situation. So we have the upper hand. We have the advantage. The first one he wants to talk about is the stranger. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, I understand that there are people with certain jobs that their job requires them to look at things differently than the rest of society. Okay? I know police officers, I've done ride-alongs, a lot of you guys know, they look at life very warped. And that's why most of them end up in divorce, and most of them end up committing suicide a few months after they quit being a cop. It's a very horrible way of living, spending many, many hours a week looking at the worst of mankind and having to confront the worst in mankind. It really does twist the brain. And then, of course, if you're in the military or if you're in politics. So on one side, the news is assuming that we're all politicians. And we need to look at people coming across the border as a bunch of legal politicians. We're all a bunch of judges that need to judge this. We're all a bunch of Border Patrol agents that need to stop this. You know what? We're none of those things, unless you are one. That's a different hat you have to wear. But for us, we're not. We're just civilians. And I lived right on the border since about 1983. I don't know what percentage of my church was illegals, but often I'd find very professional people that were not legal. I'd find out later, but never asked, but you'd find these things out. You realize that our system is really broken. I mean, people that should be citizens, they cannot get to citizenship. Right down the middle of the family. I can tell you some horrible stories. Our system is a horrible system as far as getting people to become legal citizens. It's really oppressive. But my thing was that when they come across, they're now my ministry. They're not, they're not this person that's messing up our country. This is a person I need to love and care for, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. So at one point we had just a number of Africans coming across the border. I mean, we were in our community, we made big refugee camp, and some people were complaining about it. And I'm just like going, look, how amazing is this? We get to be missionaries to Africa, but live in the comfort of our own homes while we're doing it. we're going to love these people. And we did. We brought them all in, and they were the most precious people. They were wonderful people. Just absolutely amazing. A few of the families came very, very close with us, but it was really simple for me. It's like, okay, when I vote, I'm going to vote that this doesn't happen because it's not fair to them. It's not fair to our country. It's not the way you work a country. But there's so many freaking things broken in our country. Is this really the most broken of all the broken things in our country that I want to, go to the grave and say, yeah, he tried to keep as many people out of our country as he could? Is that what I want to claim to fame? Or is it just, I loved everybody, I cared for everybody? Now, on noting that, okay, a lot of people say, well, that's why we got to help all the street people. When you go through the New Testament, when it's helping out the poor, it always talks about the body of Christ. 1 John, he's very clear. If you have a brethren, James, if your brother comes to you, so people you're worshiping with at church who are in need, those are our sheep. We do have a responsibility. The rest of them are jackrabbits and, foxes and whatever. They're not sheep. And the other thing, even in the body of Christ, it's pretty stiff. It's like if there's a guy in the church and you're helping him out financially, but he is not taking care of himself or his family. You don't work, you don't eat. You just tell him this Sunday, starve. If you're unwilling to work, we're not going to put up with this. Said the same thing to the widows in 1 Timothy 5. If they're young, don't let them be taken care of by the church because they have too much energy. They'll be busybodies and get involved in things they shouldn't be. They need to go out and get remarried and so forth. So again, even there's stipulations, but just because somebody asks you for money doesn't mean God says, oh, you give to him who asks of you. Look in context what that's saying. If I gave to every street person that asked for money, I'd soon be out of money. Then what do I do? So you just use common sense saying, look, I cannot give to every person in the world that asks for money. Even if I'm a billionaire, I'll run out of money. So again here, this is where God is saying, think about how it was for you guys in Egypt. Now, if you go back and read it in Genesis 14, Joseph had it very hard until God supernaturally turned that around. But when Joseph brought his family down, Pharaoh rolled out the red carpet, right? Anything you guys need and anything at all, we're going to take care of you. And Joseph says, get away from these Egyptians. They're crazy. Get out there and take care of sheep. They hate shepherds. That's the way I want it. I don't want them to want to be around you, and I don't want you to want to be around them. This is not a good system. But eventually they became slaves there. And it was wrong that this disadvantaged people end up being slaves in the country. It was very, very wrong of them doing that. So he's saying in the same way, you see somebody who's from another culture, speaks a different language, from another country, and they are disadvantaged. You go out of your way to welcome them. You go out of your way to embrace them. And definitely do not oppress them. And so again here, I think it's all a test. Have you ever noticed that? All of life's a test. You have the perfect neighbor next to you for 20 years. It's so wonderful. And then they move out and you get some guy who, for whatever reason, hates your guts. I've never had this happen, but I know it happens a lot. And for whatever reason, they just don't like you. And they're doing everything they can to make you miserable. I've seen stuff where people are throwing the trash in the other guy's yard, and it's like, you have a trash can, but it's just they want to get under his skin. And it's a test. How am I going to be? How am I going to react? How is Christ going to be revealed in me in this difficult situation? So right now we have millions of people coming across the border. And you know what? I find myself repeatedly, I remember as a very young Christian really in my early teenage years, and seen a number of my very committed friends, especially going to college, walking away from God and doing their own thing and trying to get me to see things their way and go along with them. And I just remember just the Lord speaking to my heart, just like Joshua. As for me, I didn't have a house. There was nobody else with me. As for me, in my house, which includes me only at this point, I'm going to serve the Lord. If that seems evil to you to serve the Lord, then you do whatever you're going to do. And it's one of these things here. It's like, as for me, I'm not a politician. I'm not a Border Patrol agent. I'm not somebody on the city council. I'm not somebody I'm a Christian. I'm an American. And this is my country, and I don't have a lot to give, but what I do have to give to those that come into my sphere and the Lord shows me, I think the Lord's got to point it out. I'm definitely not going to oppress them, but I definitely want to bless them. In the same way with the widow and the fatherless, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way and they cry out at all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall become hot, and I will kill you with a sword, and your wife shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Whoa! We learn in James, you want to know what true religion is? Keep yourself unstained by the world and care for widows and orphans. There it is. Live a personal holy life and take care of widows and orphans. Right? Paul said, and also take care of the poor, he said, which is, remember in Galatians, Peter said, oh yeah, and by the way, take care of the poor. And Paul said, I'm absolutely taking care of the poor. That's always in my heart to do. So, again, in this culture, there really wasn't anything for widows and orphans. In the Jewish culture, all the widows moved into the temple. So you had thousands, tens of thousands of them of Christ's time. And remember, when many of them believed and became Christians, the Jews said, we're not taking care of you anymore. And so the church, all of a sudden, being a few days old in the Lord, are taking care of all the widows, mostly the Hellenistic widows that didn't even speak the language, trying to take care of them because there was no other system. Now, if you look in the history, especially modern history, the last 300 years, every time you see an orphanage or you see a place to take care of the widows in a culture like, especially like India and so forth, always a Christian organization. Always. It's always a Christian organization, not an atheist organization, not a Muslim organization. It's a Christian organization that takes care of the widows and the orphan. And God says, if you see somebody disadvantaged and you take an advantage of them, God says, you've got me as a personal enemy. Pretty hot stuff. Well, the next thing is looking, again, continuing on with the poor. He says, if you lend money to any of my people, verse 25, who are poor among you, and you shall not be like a moneylender to him, you shall not charge him interest. Don't make a bad situation worse for the poor people. If you ever take your neighbor's garments as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is the only covering is a garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And if it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. So God says, yeah, you can lend them money. So this is like just food. It's basically the guy going, I've got some kids at home that need to eat. They haven't ate breakfast. I got to go work. I need some money just to give to the wife to take care of them until I get home this evening. And hopefully I'll come home with a day's wage and I can feed them dinner. I've been in cultures like that where they literally have enough money to pay for food today. It's a very humbling thing. And usually it takes them 12, 15 hours to get enough money to feed their family for one day. So he says, yeah, you can have collateral. And if they're really poor, the only collateral they have is their robe, which they're going to take off and lay on some rocks while they work. Well, you can have that as collateral. And then when they come back, they give you the money they owed you, then you can give them their garment back. But if they didn't get enough money, didn't get the job they hoped to get, didn't make enough money, you won't hang on to their garment and say, hey, freeze to death until you pay me back. No, you're not going to play hardball with this people. So it's almost the moneylender in this situation is okay to give interest and charge interest to people, to business loans and rich people building houses and stuff. You can have that part of your business, but you also, as a banker or a businessman, have to have a service where you're lending money to the poor at no interest, and it's just sort of a day-to-day, hand-to-mouth thing. I require that you do that. Interesting if banks did that today, wouldn't it? Again, deviant people take care of things, do weird things, don't they? Now let's remember that Jesus was a poor person. He was raised in a very poor town, and he was raised as a very poor child of a pretty large family, from what we understand. And it appears that Joseph, his dad, died pretty young, and Jesus was sort of the head of the home. And so he had a really great heart for poor people and their needs. It is interesting, we're going to see this in just a minute anyway, but in Luke 24:24, remember when they're going to pay for the firstborn son as a sacrifice? The poor people could give 2 turtle doves and a pair of pigeons, which would cost them about a penny to sacrifice to God. So even for the poorest of the poor, there was a way for them to honor God and worship in a sacrifice to him. Interesting how the Lord did that. Well, in verse 28, you shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of his people. And I could go into this in great detail, but Paul quotes this very passage in Acts 23 when he's being tried by the Sanhedrin and the high priest, who Paul hadn't been around Jerusalem for a long time, didn't know he was the high priest. He said, slap that guy. And they slap Paul, and Paul says, God slapped you. You're breaking the law by hitting me. And they said, hey, you can't revile the high priest. And Paul said, oh, I didn't know he was the high priest. You're right. It actually says, and then he quotes this verse 28, you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. You're absolutely right. In 1 Peter 2:17, he said, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, but honor the king. In 1 Timothy 2, he encourages to pray in all kinds of ways. And then he says also, make sure you pray for all men, but also for the kings and all those who are in authority. And it says kings plural. It's like all the variety of kings you'll see in your various kings in your lifetime and in various countries. In 2 Peter, he makes it clear there that we are not to despise authority. We're to be not presumptuous or self-will, and that we are not to speak evil of dignitaries. So again, I think in our country we have freedom of speech. Our country is so unique. We've been so blessed, but yet I think there's a line of crossing where it's like, hey, no authority gets in power unless God at least allows it, right? I mean, that's a pretty common theme all the way through the scripture. And so therefore, we should not be haughty or presumptuous and think that we can curse the ruler of our people that God has put in power. Well, finishing up here in verse 29 to 31, you shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise you shall do with your ox and your sheep, and it shall be its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you shall give it to me, and you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. So, first of all, he talks about something he's going to talk a lot about. He's already talked about this in chapter 13, and he's going to talk about it a lot, where everything that opens the womb is the firstborn, whether it's that of the field, the grains, the juice, the wines, or the animals, or even the firstborn child of a human family, all is the Lord's. In Exodus 13:2, I don't know if you remember, but he said, "It is mine. Consecrate to me all the firstborn that opens the womb among the children of Israel, both man and beast. It is mine." The tithe, the Bible later tells us, is the Lord's. But on top of that, of giving the tithe, it's not just the rear end of the tithe. It's the first, the best, the top that you give to God. So it's not, giving God's, let me figure out if I can or can't. And if there's a couple of, blind and lame animals left, and I'll just give this into the junk to God. No, God gets the first, God gets the best, he gets the top. You're honoring him first. This is a part of it. We'll talk more about that. But he does mention here, and we're going to get into more detail in Leviticus 18 on this, that the child, the firstborn child, that you are to give to God. And again, I just talked about Luke chapter 2, verse 24, where they didn't have the 5 shekels of silver. It says in Leviticus, is to be given for the firstborn. So they gave 2 turtle doves and 2 pigeons. But today, it's a ceremony. It's called Pidyon Abin. And you come together, and it's all very ceremonial. But it's interesting how the Jews look at it. For, he was saying that very few sons actually qualify. In one of the rabbis I was looking at today, because, first of all, it cannot be a cesarean, because it has to open the womb. So if it's a cesarean birth, it doesn't count. Also, if the woman had ever had a miscarriage, it doesn't count, because it's not the firstborn. Interesting. And I say there's a pretty big percentage of women that have miscarriages before they actually successfully have kids. I think it's a pretty common thing. But then it was like, who can even come to this thing? It's pretty interesting that they got to qualify. So today it's the 5 pieces of silver they bring, they actually don't give to the temple. It's just they present it to God as sort of a token, and then they hang on to those 5 very pure silver. The one rabbi I was listening to today, the one he used for his child is the one his dad was used for him and used for his dad several generations back. It was the same 5 silver coins that are hundreds of years old that they continue to reuse there. Interesting stuff. Well, any questions on this? I thought this was going to go quite a bit quicker, but it didn't.